Good evening. Leading the news this Monday, there were conflicting reports on Lebanon terrorists releasing American hostage Jesse Turner, and firefighters finally stopped a deadly fire in Northern California. We'll have the details in our news summary in a moment. Charlene Hunter-Gault is in New York tonight. Charlene?
After the news summary, the hostage story is our lead focus tonight. Next, we have a report on the campaign for the Secretary General of the United Nations. Then, on the eve of more hearings on the BCCI scandal, correspondent Paul Solman explains how the bank fooled so many people for so long.
Funding for the NewsHour has been provided by AT&T. AT&T has supported the MacNeil-Lehrer NewsHour since 1983 because quality information and quality communications is our idea of a good connection. AT&T, the right choice. And by PepsiCo, and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by the financial support of viewers like you.
There were reports today that American Jesse Turner had been freed in Beirut after nearly 5 years as a hostage. But this evening, foreign ministry officials in Syria said it hadn't happened yet. The 44-year-old college professor has been held by a group called the Islamic Jihad for the Liberation of Palestine. That group issued a statement yesterday saying an American would be released within 24 hours. The group also holds American professor Alan Steen. The U.S. State Department initially confirmed the release of Turner and called his wife in Boise, Idaho, to give her the news. But this evening, State Department spokesman Richard Boucher said he would not dispute the later Syrian report. Early today, Israel freed 15 more of its Arab prisoners. They had been held by Israel's allied militia in South Lebanon. The release was arranged under the auspices of the United Nations. Also today, Israel attacked what it said was an Arab guerrilla base in southern Lebanon. 3 civilians were wounded. The attack was an apparent reprisal for an Arab guerrilla bombing that killed 3 Israeli soldiers yesterday. After that attack, the group holding American Terry Anderson released a statement saying the Israeli raid could hamper efforts to free more Western hostages. We'll have more on this hostage story after the news summary. Charlene?
Another Democratic hat was thrown into an increasingly crowded presidential ring today. Former California Governor Jerry Brown made his announcement outside Independence Hall in Philadelphia. He said both the Democratic and Republican parties had allowed themselves to be trapped and corrupted by the powerful forces of greed. Brown is the 7th Democrat to officially announce. White House spokesman Marlin Fitzwater spoke out today against former Ku Klux Klan leader David Duke, who is now the Republican candidate for governor of Louisiana. Duke was a winner in Saturday's primary. He faces former Democratic Governor Edwin Edwards in a runoff on November 16th. When asked about the Republican candidate, Fitzwater said, "We don't support him, we don't agree with him, we don't like him." That's it for the news summary. Just ahead on the NewsHour, the hostage story, the race for UN Secretary General, and a Paul Solman primer on the BCCI scandal.
The reported, then denied release in Lebanon of American hostage Jesse Turner is our lead story tonight. Turner is a 44-year-old Beirut University professor from Boise, Idaho, who was kidnapped in January 1987. There were a number of reports from Beirut today that Turner had been freed. But late in the day, a Syrian official in Damascus told reporters the rumors were not true. No hostages had been released today. 4 Americans still remain in captivity with Turner. Associated Press correspondent Terry Anderson, captured in March 1985. Thomas Sutherland, seized 3 months later. Joseph James Sicipio of the American University in Beirut, taken hostage in September of '86. And Alan Steen of Beirut University College, who was captured at the same time as Turner. 4 Europeans, including Church of England envoy Terry Waite, are also still being held. The reports of Turner's release followed diplomatic activity in the Middle East and the United Nations. We have a backgrounder by Ian Williams of Independent Television News.
Early this morning, surrounded by Israeli soldiers, Ali Fawaz, a Lebanese captive, was driven out of Israel and back into Lebanon. With his freedom, the process of swapping hostages appeared to be back on again after more than a month's deadlock. At the same time, a further 14 Arab detainees were released from the Al-Qaim prison in southern Lebanon, where they'd been held by the Israeli-backed South Lebanese army. They were reunited with family and friends. A small fraction of the 300 detainees still held at Al-Qaim, but the first release since the process broke down amid accusations by both sides of broken promises. There was a price. On Saturday, the family of Yossi Fink, an Israeli serviceman missing in action in Lebanon since 1986, was told their son was dead. Information about him had been in Israeli condition. And it was yesterday in Beirut that Lebanese kidnappers issued a photograph of Jesse Turner, together with a statement saying a Western hostage would be released within 24 hours. Mr. Turner, one of 5 Americans still held captive, lectured in computer sciences at Beirut University College. He disappeared together with a colleague, Alan Steen. They're shown here in an earlier picture released by the kidnappers. Turner's Lebanese-born wife received a letter from her husband last week, inviting her to Beirut, where the kidnappers had promised them a meeting. Jesse Turner has never seen his daughter, who was born soon after he was kidnapped. Today's development drew an optimistic reaction from the Israeli Prime Minister, amid speculation that more Lebanese prisoners and Westerners could soon be released.
Well, I think it's one step in the series of steps we have agreed on with the Secretary General of the United Nations, and this step has to lead to the release of our prisoners and missing soldiers.
The release came in spite of clashes between Israeli forces and Lebanese guerrillas. Yesterday, 3 Israeli soldiers were killed and several others wounded in a bomb attack in southern Lebanon. Today, the Israelis retaliated by bombing what they described as a command center for pro-Iranian Hezbollah fighters in a village 8 miles north of Israel's security zone in southern Lebanon. The latest breakthroughs in the hostage crisis result from behind-the-scenes negotiations by the United Nations, and in particular, the Secretary-General's Special Envoy, Gian-Domenico Pico. Others, though, see next week's Middle East Peace Conference as the catalyst.
I would say that the Iranians particularly and their Hezbollah clients panicked, seeing that the international media were putting all their attention upon this forthcoming Middle East Peace Conference, and they don't want that. They want to be seen to be still relevant to the Middle East scene. They want to be seen to be playing a part in the fate of the Middle East.
There was little sign of panic, though, among hardline Palestinian and Lebanese groups who gathered in Tehran at the weekend for a conference strong in anti-Israeli and anti-peace conference rhetoric. And today there were warnings from Islamic Jihad, who hold other Western hostages, that Israeli raids are obstructing moves towards further hostage exchanges.
For more on this story, we go to Josh Friedman, who covers the United Nations for the New York newspaper Newsday, Andrew Whitley, who's a former Middle East correspondent for the Financial Times, now director of Middle East Watch, and to Asad ABUKHALIL, a visiting professor at Colorado College in Colorado Springs. He joins us tonight from Denver. First to you, Josh Friedman, is there anything that you picked up at the United Nations that you can add to this question of whether or not Jesse Turner was released today, and if not, what happened? Or if so, where is he?
I don't think that people who really know about what's happening are particularly worried about the details of today, tomorrow, next week. I think there's a general sense of optimism that the process is going along and will be solved soon.
So if the fact that there was a apparent foul-up today of some kind or a premature release is not something that people are all upset about?
No, not at all.
So you believe that Jesse Turner is on his, if he's not free, he will soon be free, is that right?
Well, it may not be him first. It could be another hostage, and then he'll be out later. Unfortunately, the last few months show that there's a lot of last-minute switching and psychological game playing. But I think in the long run, he and the other Western hostages will be out in the next few months.
Mr. Whitley, do you agree? Is your information jive with that?
Yes, it does. I believe that Josh is right when he says that the process is moving along. There are hitches and there will continue to be hitches. As we saw with Jackie Mann's release last month, there was a week's delay before he finally got out after it had been announced that he was going to be released. So I think all the sides are signalling that they continue to be wanting to deal. There are some significant obstacles still remaining down the road, and it may be that the peace conference will complicate matters. But nonetheless, I think for the moment the signs are still reasonably good despite tonight's uncertainties.
How do you read that uncertainty?
I think that there could be some internal bargaining going on. These groups are not monolithic by any means, and I think a deal that is struck between Mr. Pico, the UN envoy, and the representative of the hostage takers is not necessarily one that can be sold to all the others. They may be arguing that the number of people who are released by Israel today is insufficient, or they should say that perhaps some of our brethren that we had specifically asked for have not been included in this batch. We don't know, but each of them is putting in their own particular demands and wanting them now, not tomorrow.
Mr. ABUKHALIL, how do you read these events of today involving Jesse Turner specifically?
Well, I think the confusion of today has to do more than anything else with the timing. It is rather odd to have the Iranians, as well as the Syrians, as well as the Lebanese, appearing to be appeasing the West and the United States at a time when there is now a conference being held in Tehran, which is intended only to discredit the International Conference on the Middle East. So I think what we might see would be some delay, although I believe that there was already a deal that was struck in Iran in the past 4, 5, 6 weeks. And it included negotiations on the one hand between the Iranians and the Lebanese government, and the Iranians and the Syrian government on the other hand. And it involved not only the issue of the hostages, but the issue of the 3,000 Revolutionary Guards stationed in Lebanon. However, one must not lose sight of the domestic politics in Lebanon itself. For example, the bombing raid by Israel today. And also what is significant is that one of the released prisoners from Khiyam for the first time brought news about Sheikh Obeid, who is a very highly respected cleric that Israel kidnapped last year, I believe. And this
what kind of information about him?
Well, the information he brought is, for the first time, the Shiites were told that he exists, that people saw him, that he was leading prayers. And it seemed to me that aroused a lot of emotions. It increased the apprehension on the part of the captors for anything that would be viewed as being a concession to Israel. More importantly, without confusing the audience with a lot of details, what is important to note is that we have now two sets of captors. And the motivations for both of them are personal and familial rather than political. Although Iran and Syria do involve themselves in rationalizing releases and captivity through politics. One family is interested in releasing some of the hostages because a relative of the main leader of the captors was freed during the Iraqi invasion and occupation of Kuwait. He was a major reason why so many hostages were taken by this group. There, on the other hand, is another group which is very much concerned about the plight of 2 Shiite prisoners in West Germany who were convicted with bombing attacks and whatever. Now, the other set of group is interested in obstructing any attempt by the other group to release the hostages because they believe that both groups should coordinate in order to make the agenda common between both of them.
But you say 5 or 6 weeks ago a deal was struck, right?
Well, I am not judging by something that is rumorous. I am talking about reports in the Persian and Arabic press. There were details about a visit to Iran by the foreign minister of Lebanon. There was a report 2 weeks ago about a more important visit by the chief of staff of the Syrian army who was in Tehran. And it was reported that he talked with the Iranians about the Revolutionary Guards in Lebanon and about the hostages. However, as Mr. Whitley said, it seems that the issue of the conference, which is surprising to everybody in the region, could complicate matters or could postpone the release. It also could, one should also bear in mind, lead to other set of problems and very likely other set of hostages because many groups in the Middle East and Iran itself is very displeased with the conference itself. And what is also noteworthy is that the Persian press has begun in the past 10 days to criticize Syria for the first time ever really, in its role with the United States in the peace conference.
Mr. Friedman, that sounds like there's still a long way to go before this thing gets resolved. Does your information jive with what Mr. ABUKHALIL just said?
It does, in the sense that there's a big picture and there's a medium-range picture, there's a little picture. Basically, the big picture is that Iran and Israel want this problem solved. They want to get it over with. And I think all of the ins and outs and the price demanded by the particular surrogates of Iran holding people may be obstacles. But Iran has a very definite problem, which is a rapidly dwindling amount of time. They need certain cooperation from UN Secretary General Javier Pérez de Cuellar before he leaves office at the end of December. If he leaves and they haven't gotten his cooperation with regard to settlements of the Iran-Iraq war, they stand to lose up to $50 billion worth of loans that they could make from the West. I don't think that disputes between two families in Lebanon, given the ability of Iran and Syria to solve such disputes in the past, will be an obstacle. I'm sure they'll find a way to solve that dispute.
Is it your understanding, Josh, that a deal has been struck, that an overall deal for the release of all the Westerners in exchange for various prisoners in Israel has been struck, and it's just a case of going through these steps one at a time very slowly?
It's as if Iran and Israel have agreed to dance a very intricate dance. They know the name of it, they know the steps. They're about 5 steps into this 20-step dance. Sometimes they start disagreeing about who takes the next step. The point is, the rules of the game are Israel wants back either the remains or the 4 remaining Israeli servicemen who are unknown. Iran is willing, in exchange for that, to release the Western hostages but expects Israel to release the 300 or so Shiite prisoners which it holds or are held by its surrogates in southern Lebanon. Mm-hmm. How that all plays out gets confusing sometimes. Yeah. But Iran needs that to happen by the end of the year. So that's why they continually push the process and why you see them releasing people as the first initiative.
Mr. Whitley, do you agree with that there are there are all kinds of obstacles, all kinds of problems? We just heard Mr. ABUKHALIL's analysis of them, that there's more push for this to be resolved than there is holding back to keep it from being resolved?
I think I agree with the other speakers that there is an intent on all parties to try to resolve it and to resolve it as soon as can be done. There is considerable mistrust and suspicion that still remains. I think the picture is slightly more complicated than Josh Friedman presented. Obviously, he was pointing to the main elements, but there are a number of series of bilateral deals that still have to be worked out. The South Lebanon Army, for example, wants some of its hostages back who are being held by the same hostage keepers, the Islamic Jihad people. The Germans and the 2 German captives who are being held in Lebanon are also a separate deal that needs still to be finalized. So there are a number of elements. The big picture is clear, but those smaller separate bilaterals are still to be resolved.
Mr. Whitley, what is your analysis of how the Middle East Peace Conference, now set for October the 30th, just a little over a week away in Madrid, Spain, impacts the hostage situation and the other way around?
It impacts it because it gives a chance to the most reluctant of the parties to throw a spoke in at the last minute. And that's really a very serious problem which everybody is fearful of, that it could come up that at the very last moment Iran could throw in it as its card that it'll refuse to release Terry Anderson or Terry Waite, the British clerical envoy, because it doesn't like the way that the peace conference is growing. And that is a card that it has freedom to play at will almost.
Is Pérez de Cuellar aware of that problem, Josh Friedman? Is he trying to get this thing done before the peace conference, or is he trying to keep them separate, or what's the strategy?
Well, he and John Domenico Pico have been working in an atmosphere of frenzy for the last couple of months for 2 reasons. One, to a lesser degree, the conference, but to a greater degree, they know that if they don't get it done before they leave, it's going to go back to ground zero. And I didn't mean to say that it's definitely going to be solved, but there's a good chance it'll be solved. They're working, especially Pico, with a tremendous amount of urgency.
Mr. ABUKHALIL, do you agree that there is a kind of forced timetable here, that this thing doesn't get resolved by December, then the whole thing could go back to ground zero?
Well, it seems to me that the timetable has been affected to a large measure by the events and the announcement about the peace conference. And it is also inaccurate to state, as Mr. Friedman did, that all parties to the conflict are interested at this point in having a resolution of the issue. I think, for one, Iran is very much disinterested at this point, because of the announcement of the peace conference, to be perceived to be rendering a free service or a concession to the United States. There is no question that Syria is interested, but Syria has very little influence among the captors. Syria is relevant to the hostage story insofar as it produces the show of the release, orchestrating the details in order to take as much credit for the release as it can. But as far as the Iranians are concerned, it is also inaccurate to assume that the Iranians have the final say about the hostages themselves. Because after the death of Khomeini, there has been a large measure of independence that has been acquired on the part of the captors. And they never release any of their hostages without any price in return, financial, political, or even military. And I would also add that we should not underestimate the extent to which conflict between the various families affect the outcome of the hostage story. Okay. In the past, there were many instances where releases were obstructed, and sometimes hostages shifted from one place to another as a result of those conflicts.
Well, gentlemen, thank you all three very much for being with us tonight. The BCCI banking scandal returns to the headlines tomorrow as Senate hearings open on what happened and why, among other things, the federal government was so slow in doing anything about it. As a hearing preview, we have a refresher course on the scandal now by our business correspondent, Paul Solman of public station WGBH in Boston.
In a sense, BCCI is a textbook case of international bank fraud. To understand it, it helps to understand how banks and banking regulations work. Boston University School of Management was kind enough to lend us a classroom and a blackboard to help lay out the steps in the process. So, number one, you need money to start a bank, to hire the employees, to set up shop, and so on. BCCI got the money from something called the United Bank. Aga Hassan Abadi had run Pakistan's United Bank back in the 1960s. A recent documentary on Britain's Channel 4 reported that while at United, Abadi authorized $2 million in loans to a group of friends. Then it's alleged he had United Bank illegally write off the loans. With this money, Abadi and friends started BCCI. Thus, it seems, from the beginning, at BCCI, crime paid. Don Billings was a bank regulator at the Federal Reserve.
It can be rational to break the law. It's simply a question of expected value. If the payoff is $100 million and the chances of getting caught are quite small, it can be rational behavior to break the law.
So, Abadi had some startup money. It was on to step two. A bank needs to develop some trust to get a reputation. Abadi did it by making the right connections.
Doing the job, Bank of America, doing the job.
Right off, the charming Mr. Abadi made the right friends, like the prestigious Bank of America. Bank of America's good name helped launch BCCI, according to former U.S. Comptroller of the Currency, John Hyman.
Most of the banking persons around the world, people involved in banking, businesses, and certainly the regulators knew Bank of America and had to believe that they would only be associated with first-class people. People they trusted, who they thought were good bankers.
BCCI, with Bank of America's backing, opened a branch in London, as well as making deals with sheikdoms throughout the Persian Gulf. By 1980, B of A, now queasy about BCCI, dropped the partnership. But the damage had already been done. BCCI was established and eventually had branches in some 70 countries, assets of more than $20 billion. Okay, BCCI had some money, had some contacts. Now on to step number 3. Any bank needs to register in a country where regulators can keep an eye on it. BCCI wasn't crazy about scrutiny, and so it made life a little easier on itself and a little harder on those who would later look into it. BCCI did this by registering itself in the land of sun and snorkel, the Cayman Islands. Hal Scott is an expert on international banking regulation.
What is regulation like in the Caymans?
I couldn't tell you. I've never seen an example of it. I mean, I'm sure there, by the way, we joke a little bit. I'm sure that the Caymans does have regulation. It's not just a question of what's on the books. Much more, or just as important, is enforcement of the regulation. Well, we know that the Caymans just does not have those kinds of resources. So whatever they have written on the books in terms of regulation, there's a big concern about their resources with respect to enforcement.
There are certain countries that do not welcome U.S. supervisors. In fact, the nature of their comparative advantage is that they offer a certain amount of freedom from scrutiny.
And Caymans would be one of them.
Yes.
Now, almost all banks register in just one country, which puts a primary regulator in charge. One regulator means one full set of books that someone could conceivably examine. So, just to be on the safe side, BCCI registered itself in a second country, Luxembourg, the tiny European nation known for its congeniality to tourists and to foreign banks. That way, BCCI could keep the whole picture from any one set of prying eyes.
And if there is no one looking at the whole, then it is possible to move bad loans out of one bank into another bank, moving them before either the auditors or the bank examiners come in, thereby presenting a false picture of the strength of the individual bank.
So you just keep moving the bad loans back and forth ahead of the examinations?
That's right, moving bad loans, or conversely moving in good assets before the examinations or before the auditors come in to check the books.
In fact, BCCI played it even safer, hiring different auditing firms for its different domiciles. Although, as we've seen in the case of the S&Ls, auditing firms hired by banks can be a little less than enthusiastic when it comes to checking the books of their clients. Eventually, BCCI put Price Waterhouse in charge of all its books. But the firm never found anything amiss, or if it did, never blew the whistle. In fact, bank fraud is rarely discovered through an audit.
The problem is, it is a resource issue. And if the audit is being supplied by government organizations or even private organizations that the company is paying for, they don't have unlimited resources. So in the practical world, you can fool auditors.
Unfortunately, BCCI's clever regulation dodge backfired when it tried to enter the lucrative U.S. market via New York in the mid-'70s. At the time, John Hyman, now a vice chairman at Merrill Lynch, was New York State's banking commissioner.
The question, of course, comes up, how come there's not a primary regulator? And the answer was that, well, we operate in third world countries. Our systems, our patterns, our cultures are different. We've done this for tax reasons. We think this is best for our shareholders. We don't have a primary regulator. Well, now they have the choice not to have a primary regulator. Clearly, they can decide that. But we also had a choice whether to let them in the United States. We chose not to.
However, that didn't stop BCCI. Remember step number 2, making the right friends and establishing trust through the Bank of America? Well, BCCI went back to the tactic and made the right friends in the United States. In 1982, legendary Democrat and statesman Clark Clifford and his law partner, Robert Altman, helped investors purchase First American Bank. It turns out BCCI was behind the deal, although Clifford and Altman, who became the bank's chairman and president, say they were unaware of BCCI's secret dealings. In fact, over the last decade, BCCI has seemed to live up to its new nickname, Bank of Crooks and Criminals. Its customers included an odd couple, Abdul Nidal and Oliver North, and former business associates Manuel Noriega and the CIA. It also broke a cardinal rule of banking. It lost money, or perhaps gave it away, making bad loans to a variety of sheiks and other big shots. But the losses, whether inadvertent or part of some grand conspiracy, were real enough and had to be dealt with.
What I think happened is that as BCCI grew, as its need for money grew, as its losses grew, I think that management must have encouraged its officers in the field to get deposits, because by getting the deposits, they had more money with which to work, more money with which to hide the losses, and to create at least the ambiance of a real business, a real banking business.
On the other hand, maybe BCCI just wanted more money to funnel to its buddies. In either case, when a bank is desperate for money, it can go to great lengths to attract deposits.
We'll never get justice again, but the people with whom I'm dealing are the most powerful and largest drug dealers in Colombia.
I want to be very clear and positive that with you. I'm not concerned. It's not my business. But who your customers are.
That's Amjad Awan from BCCI's Tampa operation, caught in the act. A federal undercover agent posing as a money launderer is trying to make a deposit, and BCCI is apparently taking every deposit it can get.
I'm not concerned first in that because, I'm not really responsible for the models of your customers. I deal with you.
Since all cash deposits of $10,000 or more must be reported to the U.S. government, and drug dealers aren't keen on leaving their names and addresses, they're always looking for bankers who will deposit the cash on the QT.
If you're willing to do that, you would take in the deposits and then spread them in dummy names, of course. It would never be in the names of the drug dealer, but in some kind of dummy name. And then the money would be transferred to other accounts in your system that were dummy names for the drug dealer, whatever it is, in other countries, which would then in turn be transferred now perhaps to legitimate banks in other names, but companies that were controlled also by the drug dealers. And over a period of time, through many transfers of capital, eventually the investment of some of the capital, and even paying taxes on some of the capital, that the money comes out clean.
Illegal accounts help the bank grow, plus big fees can be charged on them, pure profit for the bank. Amjad Awan is currently serving a 12-year sentence for his efforts. But the point is, despite such flagrancy, BCCI managed to stay in business. With its operations in 2 countries, thereby guaranteeing lax oversight, and BCCI's skill at buying influence, it took almost 20 years for authorities in England and the U.S. to catch up with the bank. In a recent study, Hal Scott found loopholes in world banking regulation big enough to drive a BCCI through. But even with tighter regulation, scams like BCCI's will be hard to catch.
Crooks are some of the cleverest people out there. And you put down a system of regulation, and immediately they'll find a way to beat it. So we cannot protect against fraud. What we can hope to do is discover it rather promptly after it happens, but we can never be devising some foolproof system to avert fraud.
So far, at least, no American depositors have been hurt by the BCCI scandal, although depositors in other countries, especially England and the Third World, have been literally devastated. But the question that remains here is this. Did Mr. Abedi and his friends at BCCI somehow penetrate First American Bank and use the same tactics here they used around the world? In that case, First American could be in trouble and could suffer the same fate as BCCI.
Tomorrow, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee hears from Abdur Sakia, who ran BCCI's operations in Miami and New York City.